Experiencing sexual misconduct on campus is a harsh reality for many students. According to the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, as many as a third of college students, primarily women, will experience some form of sexual assault or harassment as an undergraduate student. I want you to imagine being one of those students. There are probably a million things on your mind, like whether you want to report the incident to a staff member or to the police, what resources are available to you, and what steps will be taken to account for the accused individual's behavior. Will he be reprimanded, kicked out, or face legal action? Maybe you just want to know about the resources available to you, but you don't want to make a report. Do you know who you could talk to about worrying that that person would be required to make a report, with or without your consent? These are just some of the points that I'll cover in this speech as we navigate through the history of mandatory reporting policies, like Wisconsin Statute 3611, subsection 22C, the arguments in favor of wide net mandatory reporting, and the arguments of those opposed. First, let's discuss the history of Title IX and mandatory reporting. To address the concerns of sex-based harassment and discrimination, Title IX of the Education Amendments was passed into law in 1972 and has been updated a few times since. Title IX and the policies that have spawned from it seek to eliminate discrimination based on sex and address sexual assault and harassment in federally funded education programs. Title IX requires mandatory reporting from responsible employees. These are employees who have the authority to address sexual misconduct, have been assigned that responsibility, those who a student would reasonably believe to hold that responsibility, or any supervisor of other employees. There are exceptions to who can be responsible employees, such as personnel governed by HIPAA laws, designated confidential advisors, or religious leaders. However, many campuses adopt a wide net policy in assigning who responsible employees are, and many assign all employees, which are not confidential reporters, to be responsible employees. The Wisconsin statute specifically provides that all UW employees must make reports of misconduct to the Dean of Students, and many other universities have similar policies. These policies were enacted in response to Title IX guidelines for providing support and resources to victims of sexual misconduct. In most cases, mandatory reporter is interchangeable with responsible employee, both infer a responsibility to report cases of sexual misconduct to a designated campus official. These reports must be made for every case that a reporter becomes aware of, with or without the victim's consent. Another important point that will come up later is that these reports typically include identifying information about the victim, witnesses, and perpetrators. With the history of these policies in mind, let's turn our attention towards arguments made by those in favor of universal mandatory reporting, or favorable parties. First, favorable parties argue that these policies provide standardization across campuses, making the process easier to understand and allowing for codified training of employees. This system, they claim, eases the burden of knowledge on victims, especially those who have changed colleges or universities and may otherwise be unfamiliar with the policies of the campus. Second, favorable parties argue that the increased number of reports made over recent years of campus sexual misconduct is indicative of an increase in the number of students using Title IX services. According to 2018 and 2023 campus climate reports from the University of Wyoming, rates of sexual assault decreased from 21% to 18% in the 5 years between the surveys. Favorable parties thus argue that this decrease is at least partially attributable to an increase in Title IX usage that would otherwise not be present without mandatory reporting policies. The final argument made by favorable parties is that these policies provide an avenue for legal recourse against the school or employee if the report of sexual misconduct is ignored or not thoroughly investigated. Additionally, federal regulations like Title IX and the Jean Cleary Act of 1990 require regular dissemination or dispersal of reports on campus climate and sexual assault cases across all federally funded education programs. So not only could there be trouble for the university or employee for not complying with local or state regulations, but there could also be federal consequences for the university. Now that we've covered arguments made by favorable parties, let's move to arguments made by those in opposition. The first and most common argument is that these policies jeopardize the confidentiality of the victim and that this risk outweighs the potential benefits of a report. As I mentioned earlier, mandatory reporters provide identifying information in the reports, such as the victims' and perpetrators' names. Even though the records of these reports are protected by the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, opposing parties argue that the victim's identity is not fully protected. The second argument made by those in opposition is that mandatory reporting infringes on the autonomy and rights of the victim. Opposing parties argue that potential benefits of mandatory reporting are outweighed by the erosion to the voice and wishes of the victim when they need their agency the most. Historically, mandatory reporting policies have been implemented to protect vulnerable populations like children who aren't legally independent or autonomous. And opposing parties argue that college students are adults who can make their own decisions and don't fall into that category. They also argue that, in general, survivors do not agree with current policies. A 2020 study conducted by Catherine Holland, a psychologist from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, found that more than 90% of survivors did not approve of mandatory reporting. The third argument is that these policies can endanger a victim's relationship with a potential resource provider. This claim stems from the fact that individual teachers or professors are often designated as mandatory reporters and are likely to be who victims go to after experiencing sexual misconduct. The argument follows that victims may not seek support at all, rather than complicating their relationship with a professor, and are then further isolated and limited in how to address sexual misconduct. Now that we've explored why mandatory reporting policies are so controversial, let's take a moment to let the information really settle in. From the inception of Title IX in the 70s to individual university policies that assign all employees as mandatory reporters, we covered a lot of ground on why this topic is so controversial. And if it still seems unclear, you're not alone. The discussion lives on because nobody has found the answer yet. But the conversation is moving forward, and more voices are contributing all the time. We're contributing right now. Now, equipped with this knowledge about the situation, I'd like to bring you back to the scenario from the beginning, but instead I want you to imagine that you're the responsible employee or mandatory reporter. How do you think you'd feel being required to report an incident of sexual misconduct, even if the victim doesn't want to? Thank you.